My name's Alex. I'm 28, and I recently accomplished something I never thought I would. I bought a house. It wasn't some sprawling mansion, but a cozy little place I could finally call my own after years of shared apartments and dorm rooms. It was a symbol of all the hard work I'd put in since I was practically a kid. You see, my dad, John, wasn't exactly father of the year material. He shipped me off to boarding school when I was 8, and after that, I was pretty much on my own. College, part-time jobs, the whole 9 yards. I did it all solo. When I finally got the keys to that house, I felt this surge of pride. I wanted to share it, even with the family that had been largely absent for most of my life. I figured a housewarming party was in order. Big mistake. My dad showed up with his wife Marissa and my stepsister Ashlin. Ashlin, or Ash as everyone called her, was 5 years younger than me and the apple of my dad's eye. She was also the human embodiment of trouble. But we'll get to that later. Anyway, the moment my dad stepped into the house, I could see the envy in his eyes. He peppered me with questions about the furniture, the architect, and the interior designer, all with this thinly veiled disdain. It was like he couldn't stand the fact that I, the son he'd practically abandoned, had managed to build a life for myself. The party itself was awkward. My friends and colleagues were there, including my boss, and my dad just kept making these snide remarks, trying to undermine me. It was embarrassing to say the least. A week later, I got a call from him. He said it was urgent, so I rushed home from work, only to find a scene straight out of a soap opera. Marissa was fuming, Ash was giving me the stink eye, and my dad was pacing around like a caged tiger. He sat me down and proceeded to give me a lecture about how I was unbothered by the serious situation in the room. Turns out, Ash was pregnant. And the guy who knocked her up had promptly dumped her. Now, I'm not heartless. I was actually ready to offer some financial help, but what came next completely blindsided me. My dad, with a straight face, told me I was giving my house to Ashlin. Yeah, you heard that right. Giving my house to Ashlin. I was speechless. I tried to reason with him, offering to let her stay in a spare room rent-free, but he wouldn't hear of it. He insisted that I move out and buy another house for myself. He even had the audacity to say that I should be responsible for all of Ash's expenses, including the bills and the baby. I was furious. I told him that was absolutely not happening and walked out. But he didn't stop there. A week later, while I was at work, he somehow got into my house and had all my stuff moved out. I came home to find my belongings piled up on the sidewalk, with movers telling me the owner had ordered them to throw everything out. I lost it. I stormed inside and found my dad and Ash there, still demanding that I do what brothers should do. I told them to leave, threatened to call the cops, and finally they left, spewing curses and insults as they went. I was shaken. I couldn't believe what had just happened. Was I wrong to refuse? Did I owe them that much? I mean, they were my family, but they'd been so neglectful and unbothered about me for most of my life. Now suddenly, they expected me to sacrifice everything for them? I felt lost and confused. I needed to vent, to get some perspective. So I turned to the one place where I could anonymously share my story and get some honest opinions: Reddit. The response on Reddit was overwhelming. People were outraged on my behalf, calling my dad and stepmom every name under the sun. It felt good to have that support, to know that I wasn't crazy for thinking their demands were unreasonable. But amidst the anger and validation, there was also a sense of sadness. This was my family, after all, and the whole situation just felt messy. I got a call from Ash. She wanted to meet, and to my surprise, she actually sounded subdued. Normally, she was all arrogance and attitude, but this time, there was a tremor in her voice. We agreed to meet at a coffee shop, a neutral ground since I wasn't ready for another confrontation at my house. When I saw her, she looked like a shadow of her usual self. Gone was the brash, confident girl who thought she had the world on a string. Instead, she was fidgety, her eyes red-rimmed, and her voice barely above a whisper. She started by telling me that she and her boyfriend had broken up. I told her I knew that her dad had mentioned it, but she shook her head. "That's what Dad thinks," she said. Turns out, her boyfriend hadn't left just because of the baby. He'd found out about some things she'd been involved in, And the pregnancy was the final straw. She was vague about the details, but I had a sinking feeling I knew what she was talking about. I'd seen her sneaking out at odd hours, taking calls from strange men, and my friend had even shown me her, let's just say, questionable online presence. I didn't push her for specifics. It felt weird prying into my stepsister's, well, that side of her life. But then she dropped a bombshell. She started talking about how she'd gotten caught up in a world of shady dealings, all because of Marissa's influence. According to Ash, Marissa had always pushed her to find a rich man, to use her youth and beauty to secure a comfortable life. College was scoffed at. Real jobs were beneath her. So, Ash, being young and impressionable, fell into the trap. She tried modeling, but that led to some really dark places. She ended up being exploited by older men, basically used as a high-priced escort. She eventually managed to break free from that scene, but the damage was done. She'd developed a warped view of relationships and self-worth. She bounced from one bad situation to another, always chasing that easy money, that validation from men. The story poured out of her, a mix of regret, self-pity, and desperation. She talked about her failed OnlyFans attempts, the stalkers, the obsessive men, and the constant need for cash. It was a train wreck, and I couldn't help but feel a mix of disgust and pity for her. She admitted that she'd lied to our dad about everything. He thought she was a struggling model with a deadbeat ex-boyfriend. He had no idea about the escorting, the online stuff, or the multiple potential fathers she was getting money from. She said she wanted me to help her, financially and by making things right with our dad. She wanted me to give her the house, to play the dutiful brother and smooth things over. I listened patiently, but inside, I was seething. Was she serious? After everything she'd done, after the way she and my dad had treated me, she expected me to just hand over my hard-earned home? I told her I could help with some money, but the house was non-negotiable. She exploded, calling me selfish, heartless, and deserving of the orphanage I'd narrowly escaped as a kid. Then she stormed off, leaving me with a churning stomach and a head full of questions. Was I being selfish? Was I obligated to help her, even after everything? I mean, she'd confessed to some pretty awful things, but did that justify her demands? And could I even trust her? I felt like she was being truthful, but was it all just a ploy to get what she wanted? I needed more advice, more perspectives. So I revised my Reddit post, laying out Ash's side of the story and asking for their thoughts. The responses came flooding in, a mix of sympathy for Ash's situation and condemnation for her choices. It was a lot to process, but one thing was clear: this was far from over. The Reddit community was buzzing with my latest revise. People were divided on Ash, some sympathizing with her upbringing and the pressures she faced, others calling her out for her poor choices and manipulative behavior. I was still wrestling with my own feelings, trying to figure out what my responsibility was in all of this. Then, my dad called. He wanted to meet at a bar, of all places, to settle a few things. I was hesitant, but curiosity got the better of me. I agreed to meet him, hoping for some kind of resolution, or at least some clarity. We sat at the bar, the tension thick between us. He started by saying he knew how much I earned. Apparently, he'd done some digging, probably talked to some of my colleagues. He said he knew I could afford to buy another house. I couldn't believe it. He was still harping on about the house. I told him I already had a house, that this whole conversation was pointless. He countered with the family needs argument, saying it was harder for women to raise a child alone, that the baby needed a stable home. I reminded him that Ash had been living with them just fine, and a baby wouldn't change that. Then I asked what she would do alone in a whole house while pregnant. She needed support, people around her. That quote, when he dropped another bombshell. He said he and Marissa would move in with Ash, in my house. I just stared at him, dumbfounded. Before I could even process that absurdity, the bartender let out a snort. My dad, never one to take an insult lying down, turned on him, demanding to know what was so funny. And that's when the real drama began. The bartender, with a smirk, said, "She uses everyone and then throws them away." My dad, enraged, asked if he knew who he was talking about. The bartender nodded. "Yeah, She's my girlfriend. My jaw dropped. This was Ash's ex, the guy who supposedly got her pregnant and left Dot. The bar went silent. My dad, fists clenched, started grilling the guy about why he'd abandoned his responsibilities. The bartender just laughed. "I'm not responsible for that family," he said. "And I sure as hell am not raising a kid that isn't mine." He then proceeded to tell us, in graphic detail, how he'd had a vasectomy, how he'd caught Ash with other men, how she'd lied and cheated and used him. He even mentioned her online activities, confirming my worst suspicions. I watched my dad's face go through a kaleidoscope of emotions: anger, shock, disbelief, and finally, this crushing disappointment. He got up without a word and walked out, leaving me with a stranger who had just exposed my family's dirty laundry. Later that night, my dad texted me, saying he had to pick Marissa up from her yoga class. Something told me that wasn't going to be a pleasant conversation. The next day, Ash showed up at my door, a sobbing mess. She blamed me for ruining everything, saying I'd told her dad about her ex. I calmed her down, explaining that it was the bartender who spilled the beans. She then launched into a tearful account of how her dad had confronted her, how he was disgusted with her lifestyle, how he'd ordered her to quit everything and find a good man. She felt humiliated, lost, and abandoned. As she was ranting, she mentioned that Marissa had been unusually quiet during the whole good women lecture. "Like she could say anything," Ash scoffed. Then she added, "One of the things she can't speak about." I asked her what she meant, and she said, "Marissa couldn't have an opinion since she is yoga." Yoga? What did that even mean? I was completely lost, but Ash was too caught up in her own misery to explain. She left, leaving me with another cryptic clue and a growing sense of unease. What was going on with Marissa and her yoga? Was Ash going to be okay? And what about my dad? Would he still try to force me to take care of his pregnant daughter, even after learning the truth about her? I had to find out. I revised my Reddit post again, sharing the latest developments and asking for their insights. The comments poured in, speculating about Marissa's secret and what it meant for my family. I was grateful for their support, but I knew I couldn't just sit back and watch this drama unfold. I had to take action. The Reddit hive mind was on fire. Everyone had a theory about Marissa and her mysterious yoga. Some thought she was having an affair. Others guessed she was involved in something illegal. A few even joked that she was secretly a ninja warrior, training in the shadows. I appreciated the humor, but the truth was, I was starting to get really worried. I decided to confront my dad. I told him I'd changed my mind, that I was willing to help raise Ash's baby. I offered her a room in my house and said I'd cover some of the expenses, but she needed to find a job as soon as possible. To my surprise, he wasn't his usual dismissive self. He actually seemed thoughtful. He sat down heavily on the couch and confessed that he thought I hated him. I didn't deny it. I asked him why he thought that, and he said, "Because your mom hated me too." That caught me off guard. My mom never said a bad word about him. She always told me he loved me, that he cared. I told him that, and he just sighed, rubbing his eyes with a weariness that seemed to age him 10 years. Then he started talking about my mom, about their relationship, about how he'd never really felt a spark with her. He admitted that he'd gotten her pregnant, which is why they'd gotten married in the first place. My stomach twisted. I'd never known this. He went on to say that he'd met Marissa while he was still with my mom. Marissa, he said, was the kind of woman who ignited something in him, a passion he'd never known. But before he could figure out what to do, Marissa got pregnant too. He wanted to tell my mom, to do things the right way, but Marissa, insecure and afraid of losing him, took matters into her own hands. She went to my mom and told her everything. My parents' divorce, the event that had shaped my entire childhood, was the result of my dad's affair with my stepmom. I felt sick. He said he'd spent a happy year with Marissa before my mom died, and he had to bring me home. But Marissa resented me, saw me as a threat to her own child. So he sent me away to boarding school, a convenient solution to keep the peace. He finished his confession with a pathetic, "Love makes you do stupid things." I wanted to punch him. I wanted to scream at him for ruining my life, for abandoning me, for choosing his mistress over his own son. But I held it in. I just turned away, trying to process this new information. That quote S when I saw Marissa standing in the doorway, a water bottle in her hand. She said she was going to her yoga class and walked into the kitchen. I followed her, wanting to give her back the water bottle she'd left on the table. But when I got outside, she was already in her car driving away. I got in my car and, on impulse, decided to follow her. She parked outside a yoga studio, but instead of going in, she walked into an alley, got into another car with a man, and they drove off. Yoga, huh? I parked my car and went into the yoga studio. I asked about Marissa, but they said they had no client by that name. I went back to my car and waited. When the other car returned, I started recording a video. The man got out, opened the door for Marissa. They hugged and kissed, and he even slapped her ass as she walked towards the studio. So much for yoga. I left before she could see me. My dad, the man who cheated on my mom, was now being cheated on himself. Karma, I guess. He called a few times, but I didn't answer. I needed time to think, to process everything. I had this video evidence of Marissa's infidelity, and I wasn't sure what to do with it. Should I show it to my dad? Confront Marissa? Just delete it and pretend I never saw anything? I revised my Reddit post one last time, sharing the latest twist and asking for advice. The comments were a mix of, "Show him the video," and "Stay out of it." It was a tough call. But I knew one thing. This whole saga was about to come to a head. The Reddit responses were pouring in, a torrent of opinions and advice. Some urged me to show the video to my dad, to expose Marissa's lies and give him a taste of his own medicine. Others cautioned me to stay out of it, arguing that it wasn't my place to interfere in their marriage. I wrestled with the dilemma, the weight of the video heavy in my pocket. Finally, I decided I couldn't keep quiet. This wasn't just about my dad anymore. It was about Ash, about the future of this messed up family. I had to confront Marissa. I waited until my dad wasn't home, and Ash was asleep. I found Marissa in the kitchen, stirring a pot of pasta sauce. I casually asked if she'd been to her yoga class that day. She said she went every day, even Sundays. "Who's your instructor?" I asked, trying to sound nonchalant. She gave me a name, some generic-sounding female name. "That's a woman?" I pressed. "Of course," she laughed. "Why would I have a male instructor?" "Just curious," I said, my heart pounding. "It's funny because the studio you go to doesn't have any female instructors." The spoon clattered against the pot. She turned around, her eyes narrowed. "What are you getting at?" I told her what I'd seen, how I'd followed her, how I'd witnessed her meeting with another man. She denied it, of course, but her voice was shaky, her hands trembling. "Even if it's true," she said, "your dad would never believe you." I pulled out my phone and played the video. Her face went white. She stood there, speechless, for what felt like an eternity. Then, to my astonishment, she just shrugged and went back to stirring the pasta sauce. "It doesn't matter anymore," she said calmly. "I was planning to divorce him anyway." This woman was unbelievable. My dad might have deserved it, but her cold-heartedness was chilling. She then proceeded to tell me the whole sordid story. The man in the video, she explained, was her lover of 3 years. They'd had a passionate affair long ago, but he was married then, and too much was at stake. They'd made a pact. He would get his finances in order, divorce his wife, and then they would be together. But then Marissa got pregnant with Ash. Desperate to secure a provider, she'd latched onto my dad. They'd been seeing each other on and off, and when she found out she was pregnant, she'd forced his hand. She'd gone to my mom and exposed the affair, leading to their divorce. Now, her old lover was a widower, and they were free to be together. She finished her story with a smug smile, saying, "Women need to do what they can." But her smile vanished as she looked past me. I turned to see my dad standing in the doorway, his face contorted with rage. He'd heard everything. He stormed into the kitchen, waking Ash up and bringing her with him. He demanded to know who her father was. Ash, looking terrified, just shook her head and said she didn't care, that he was the only dad she'd ever known. My dad, his world crumbling around him, paced the floor, his anger palpable. The next few days were a blur of shouting, accusations, and tears. Marissa and Ash were kicked out, the divorce proceedings were initiated, and my dad was left a broken man. Marissa and Ash ended up in a shelter. Her lover, the man she'd been so sure would take her in, denied any involvement with her. She begged me to delete the video, to give her a chance to salvage the situation. She even tried to guilt me, saying I should think of Ash and her unborn child. But I couldn't forget her own words. Your kid, your problem. I was still wrestling with what to do with the video when my dad asked me to find him a therapist. He apologized for everything, for the neglect, the abandonment, and the lies. I forgave him, not because he deserved it, but because I needed to move on. This whole ordeal had left me exhausted and emotionally drained. I revised my Reddit post one last time, sharing the final chapter of this family drama. The comments were filled with sympathy for my dad, anger at Marissa, and concern for Ash. I still hadn't decided what to do with the video. Should I delete it and let Marissa try to rebuild her life, or should I keep it as a reminder of her deceit? I wasn't sure. But as I read through the comments, one thing became clear. I wasn't alone. The Reddit community had been there for me through it all, offering support, advice, and a sense of belonging, and for that, I was truly grateful. The Reddit community, my digital family, continued to offer support and advice. Many urged me to delete the video, saying it served no purpose now that Marissa was facing the consequences of her actions. Others suggested I keep it as a form of insurance, a safeguard against any future attempts at manipulation. I weighed their words carefully, my mind a battlefield of conflicting emotions. In the end, I decided to delete the video. It felt like the right thing to do, a way to close this painful chapter and move forward. Marissa was already paying the price for her deceit, and I didn't need to add to her misery. Besides, holding on to that video felt like clinging to the past, and I was ready to embrace the future. My dad, with the help of therapy, was slowly starting to heal. He was remorseful, genuinely regretful for the way he'd treated me and my mom. We started talking more, rebuilding a relationship that had been fractured for so long. It wasn't easy. There were still moments of awkwardness and resentment, but we were both making an effort. Ash, however, was a different story. She was still reeling from the fallout, angry at the world and blaming everyone but herself for her predicament. She refused to see how her own choices had led her to this point. I tried to reach out, to offer support, but she pushed me away. I realized that she needed time to process everything, to come to terms with her own mistakes. Life gradually started to return to a semblance of normalcy. I focused on my work, my friends, and my newfound relationship with my dad. I even started dating again, cautiously exploring the possibility of finding someone special. One evening, my dad and I were having dinner at my house. He looked at me, his eyes filled with a mix of sadness and gratitude. "You know," he said, "your mom would be proud of you." I felt a lump in my throat. It was the first time he'd mentioned my mom in a long time. "I think so too," I said softly. We sat in comfortable silence for a while. The ghosts of the past finally laid to rest. I realized that forgiveness wasn't about condoning someone's actions. It was about freeing yourself from the burden of anger and resentment. I had forgiven my dad, not for his sake, but for mine. As for Ash, she eventually reached out to me. She apologized for her behavior, admitting that she'd been blinded by anger and self-pity. We started talking again, slowly rebuilding a sibling bond that had never really existed. She even found a job, a legitimate one, and was determined to create a better life for herself and her child. My story, the one that had captivated and outraged the Reddit community, was finally over. It was a story of betrayal, deceit, and forgiveness. It was a story about the complexities of family, the enduring power of love, and the resilience of the human spirit. And as I looked back on everything that had happened, I realized that I had emerged from the ashes of this family drama stronger, wiser, and more at peace than ever before. The journey had been painful, but it had led me to a place of self-discovery and acceptance, and for that, I was truly grateful.